Hi, everybody. This is Steve Ludwig, host of Steve Ludwig's Classic Pop Culture at planetludwig.com. Here's an interview I did with Steve Boone, co-founder and bassist of the legendary Lovin Spoonful. It was originally broadcast on April 15th, 2017. Due to copyright restrictions by YouTube, the songs mentioned during this interview won't be heard. However, if you'd like to hear the complete show with the songs, simply go to planetludwig.com and search for show number 121 with Steve Boone. And now, enjoy the interview.
Classic pop culture. It's classic pop culture. Hosted by Steve Ludwig. It's classic pop culture. It's classic pop culture. Classic pop culture.
You didn't have to be so nice. Of course, the Lovin Spoonful. And if you'd have told me when I was a teenager in the 60s, playing my Kama Sutra Lovin Spoonful 45s and albums on my record player, that I'd be speaking with the man who wrote so many of those glorious songs and made them sound so special with his tasty bass lines, I'd have said it's only a dream. Well, today I have proof that dreams do come true, as it's my honor and privilege to welcome to Classic Pop Culture author, songwriter, musician, and a member of the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, the co-founder of the Lovin Spoonful, the magnificent Mr. Steve Boone. Mr. Boone, welcome to the show.
Well, thanks, Steve, so much. It is a pleasure to be here. You didn't have to be so nice.
Perfect. Well, listen, it's easy when I have a guest such as you on the show. It's one of the real pleasures of me being able to do a show like this when I have greats like you, people that have meant so much to my musical upbringing.
It's a complete pleasure. I'm really pleased and glad to be on your show.
Thank you. I appreciate that so much. May I call you Steve?
Yeah, absolutely.
So, Steve, I swear on both of my parents' graves that I'm not just saying this, but You Didn't Have to Be So Nice is my favorite Lovin Spoonful song. And it's practically totally written by Steve Boone, perhaps an assist from John Sebastian. What can you tell us, our audience, about the writing of You Didn't Have to Be So Nice?
Well, first of all, I don't want to downgrade John's contribution to it. He essentially made the song come together, and his writing parts of it are what I came up with was the melody and the original line of the title. You didn't have to be so nice, I would have liked you anyway. And then on the piano, which is not my main instrument, I wrote it, but when we transferred it to the studio, of course I played the bass, and there really wasn't a piano part on it. So it was a wonderful effort because it was my first co-write with John, and working with John is an absolute delight. He is one of the few songwriters, maybe very, very few, that really can tie a wonderful lyric to a very catchy melody. And that seems to be his forte. And with You Didn't Have to Be So Nice, whenever we get stuck on a lyrical passage that was already over the musical bed, John would be able to tie it together. So working with him as a songwriter was a first for me on You Didn't Have to Be So Nice. And since I was so new to Lovin Spoonful and the wonderful guitar playing that both John and Zolly developed, it was just, like, as you said earlier, like being in a dream. And the dream came true when the record actually got on the air. So it was a great experience, and I can't put it into words how important it was for me in terms of my confidence in the fact that the Lovin Spoonful was going to have some continued success.
I'll tell you, it was perfect time in my life. A teenager, You Didn't Have to Be So Nice, I Would Have Liked You Anyway. That sums up, I think, just about every teenage boy and girl's feelings. I mean, it was perfectly in that couplet there, boy. You perfectly captured what I was going through anyway in my life.
Well, it was at a point, I was 20 years, maybe just turned 21, And, all the anxieties the young man has, especially meeting somebody new. It was written about an actual occurrence. It wasn't made up out of a whole cloth. And so there was a lot of anxiety in my mind as I came up with this, first the melody and then the original couplets of lyrics. So, yeah, it really did. It touched on a nerve, but it was a good touch.
Yes. Oh, was it ever? It's funny you mentioned that songs that you wrote, many of them do touch on actual occurrences, which we're going to talk about a few of those songs later on in the interview as well. But much of what we talk about, Steve, is will be things that I learned from reading your really exceptional book, Hotter Than a Match Head, Life on the Run with the Lovin Spoonful. If I may, before we talk about it, I'd like to read some of the reviews, some of the really great reviews of the book. All right, here are just a few. Phew, it's a wild ride, and Boone has some serious storytelling talents and got himself into some hairy situations. Hotter Than a Match Head tells it all in bright, colorful fashion. I mean, we all believe in magic, right? And also, damn if you won't be unable to put the damn thing down. People send me these books all the time, and I skim and toss them, but not Hotter Than a Match Head, Life on the Run with the Lovin Spoonful, because of those songs. Some other reviews. Honest and frank. Hits, warts and all, a great read. Steve Boone does a great job of helping us understand the 60s culture. And incredible. I couldn't agree more with all those reviews, Steve. Congratulations on such a wonderful book.
Well, thanks, Steve, so much. And I have to put Tony Moss's name out there.
Yes.
When in 2009, Tony called me up. He was from Baltimore, but living in Philadelphia at the time and working for CBS Sports as an editor. But he said, I had always heard about your recording studio in Baltimore, and I'd like to do an article from it, being as how I'm from Baltimore, and pitch it to the Baltimore Magazine. And I agreed, and it was so well done, and I had so many articles done over the years that weren't so well done, that when he did get it published in Baltimore Magazine, I called him back up and actually went up to Philadelphia and met with him to ask him if he would consider writing the book with me. And he said, I would love to do it, but the big obstacle in our path is the fact that you're living in Florida now, and I'm still here in Philadelphia, and I don't know how we could get together enough to make that work out. I said, well, just don't forget the idea. Let's stay in touch. And we parted ways. 1 week later, almost like a cosmic blast, phone rings. Tony says, you're not going to believe this, but my job just got transferred to Florida.
Oh, boy.
So from that point on, we knew that we were ordained to write this book. And Tony, like I describe it in one sentence, brought my words to life that sounded like Steve Boone speaking. He really captured the way I describe and talk about things. So without his help, the book would have been very difficult to finish.
Well, I'll tell you, Steve, like you said, it brought your Steve Boone out. You have one of the greatest narrative voices, great sense of humor, dry sense of humor in many places, and it's one of those books that listeners you can't put down. I usually read at night, Steve, and it was getting later and later, and I said, okay, one more chapter. It is just such like the one review said, warts and all, and you've got a little rhetorical, but you've got to be quite proud of the job you did.
Oh, I am terrifically proud of it. We all wondered who was going to, in the band that is, who was going to be the person that actually tells the story. And I was glad to find a publisher because we waited we didn't wait, but the events took place for almost 40 years before the book got published. And it was hard to find a publisher because of that fact, because so much time had lapsed. But we did find a great publisher, ECW in Toronto, Canada, and Jack David, the publisher, gave me a big boost of confidence by having lunch with me down in Florida when he was on vacation. And so the book got launched with a whole lot of integrity and a lot of enthusiasm for telling the story of the Lovin Spoonful, because as you know, having read the book, the story is not just the hits. There's so much underplay that went on and things that carried over into the years after the 1960s, and that the public really needed to know these things, and I felt it was my obligation to find a publisher and to get the story out. And I'm just so glad that it came out the way it did, because it stuck to the truth, and that was real important to me.
Yeah, I mean, it's very appreciated that you really didn't pull any punches, and like you said, you cover the hits, but certainly not just the hits. There's so much to tell about the Lovin Spoonful and the Steve Boone story. You didn't hold back, but it must have been quite cathartic.
Well, in a way, it was very cathartic, because not so much, but there was rumor and innuendo about what happened with the drug bust, and that what happened to cause Zowie to leave the band, and why did the band seemingly break up at the very height of its career. And over the years, people have speculated. There have been stories written. There have been interviews done. But I never thought that the complete story got told. And one thing I've always lived my life is that if they say this thing, if you do the crime, you got to pay for it with the time. And I don't mean to say that the Lovin Spoonful was crime, but I wanted to make sure that if we told the story, it had to be the true story and not just speculation and conjecture. So it was real important to me to tell the story of the Lovin Spoonful so that fans of the band could understand why we did seemingly break up at the height of our career, and other things that went on. So I was just so thrilled to be able to get the book published that it was just like a cathartic release. You couldn't have hit the nail on the head any better than describing it that way.
From the opening sentences of the book, Steve, you put it out there about your battles with addiction, and I see the book as one of a story of redemption. Do you ever think, in the lowest part, that you'd ever get things under control like you have now?
Well, that's a complex answer to a very complex question. Addiction is mostly a mental situation, but it's compounded by, in certain cases, a very physical reaction to the stopping the use of certain drugs. And all of this information was not available to us when we were 20, 21 years old. We were just basically, my experience with drugs was mostly beer prior to becoming like a 16, 17-year-old, and we experimented with marijuana. But we were told that all drugs were just absolutely the worst, and that no matter what you did, if you tried any of these illegal drugs, of course illegal was the word, that you were going to be faced with an addiction you couldn't deal with. So when I tried marijuana and found that it had no addictive, or at least to me, it didn't make me feel as though if I didn't have any tomorrow, I couldn't live. It was, in fact, I was many times when I'd go weeks without any pot and didn't know any fall off at all. So from that little tidbit of information, I assumed, well, maybe the information on the other drugs, the powdered drugs and the pills, maybe they're not as accurate as what I've been told about marijuana. And so it led to a false sense of security. And so when I did experiment with pills, and when I did experiment with cocaine, and then eventually with opiate drugs, I went into it thinking, well, I can just stop this when I don't want to do it anymore. But then you find out that there are certain drugs that you can't just stop physically because you become too disabled. You can't really get out of bed. It's a terrible feeling.
Yeah.
So it was all very much of a mind awakening of how do you deal with addiction when you really weren't prepared for it when you went in. And by saying all that, it's a message to young people and to people that think experimenting with drugs is a one-size-fits-all. It's not. We need to be more honest about what drugs have which reactions and what drugs become truly addicted or just psychologically, where you just want to do them but you don't get sick when you stop. So that was all new to me, and as a result, I had a terrible time of getting off the opiated drugs because they just would make you so sick when you'd stop doing them that the only relief you could find was to do more. So it was a long road of opiated drugs. But with the other drugs, with pot and some, I didn't really take many pills, but with with cocaine and pot. If I didn't have anything in the morning, it was no big deal. He just went on, had a cup of coffee, and started a new day.
Yeah.
But with the opiated drugs, it was an entirely different ball game, and I had to find that out the hard way. So that's why I put so much emphasis on it in the book.
Yeah. Well, I personally, and I assume many of our listeners know at least someone in their family or a friend who has gone through the same thing, and your honesty, Steve, in the book is so much appreciated, and you really put yourself out there, and I just wanted to thank you for making that such a part of the book.
Well, if it helps one person
Yep.
make their choices, then I feel like I've done a huge accomplishment. Just one person being able to avoid the pitfalls of that type of addiction. If it helps one person, I feel good about the entire book.
Yeah, well, listeners, you can get the book, by the way, of course, at the usual outlets, Amazon.com and so forth. But you can also get the book at steveboone.net. And, of course, we're talking about Hotter Than a Match Head, Life on the Run with the Lovin Spoonful. Also, if you don't mind, Steve, I'd like to give the lovinspoonful.com website, which keeps people up to date on your all things Lovin Spoonful. So we have lovinspoonful.com, steveboone.net.
And
Yes.
I'm sorry.
No, go right ahead.
I was just going to say that lovinspoonful.com is in the process of a major overhaul, and we're going to be having some new and exciting things to add to the website, which was a good website. It just needed being brought up to date. And so if listeners go there now, they will see the current website, but in the coming month, they will see a transition to the new one, and it's going to be really good. So I just thought I'd mention that.
Yeah, excellent, because this is a good website as it is. I can imagine how much greater it's going to be in a few months. I had the pleasure, Steve, my two brothers, Bill and Tom, and I had the pleasure of seeing you recently in Montclair, New Jersey at the Wellmont Theater.
Oh, at the Wellmont, right? Yeah.
You shared the bill with Johnny Rivers.
It was a great show. Well, even with the snow, and I took a complete header in the snow. If I hadn't had my backpack on, I probably would have cracked my skull. But anyway, it was a great show. We had a great time.
Yeah. I almost feel foolish saying this, but Joe Butler, I suppose I realize it, but he has a wonderful voice.
Joe, and John Sebastian is even known to have said that of everybody in the band, Joe had the most natural voice, the most purest of the four vocalists in the band. And I wouldn't argue with that. Joe is the oldest of the band, and he comes from that transition era that my older brother Skip came from. That it came of age in the very early 50s and not the mid 50s like I and John and Zolly did. And so they have a little bit of a touch of that late 40s, early 50s vocal style. But Joe is, and still to this day, has a fabulous voice.
Yeah. When you think, Steve, of how many millions of people you've made happy and how you've helped many through tough times with the music, is it sometimes overwhelming knowing that you have that impact?
Well, it's an abstract because you don't, in your everyday life, you don't feel the impact. But when we do a show, and especially after the show when folks come up to greet us after the show, and the comments that you hear, and the comparisons that people will make to their meeting their wife or their first date, or being in Vietnam in a foxhole and being able to hear one of our songs, those things really tie together all of the platitudes, because words are just words, but when you hear it spoken from somebody whose life it directly impacted, then it really does strike home, and it's heartfelt, and it means a lot to everybody in the band. I can say that with absolute certainty. To hear how people feel about the music from the Lovin Spoonful, how it affected their life.
Yes, Steve.
Go ahead.
No, I was going to say, one of the radio stations that this show, Classic Pop Culture, is heard on is Village Connection Radio in Long Island, New York. Long Island played a big part in your life.
Yes, it did. As a matter of fact, to condense it into a somewhat of a short story, it's very important in my life because in 1958, I had been living in St. Augustine, Florida, in a place that I considered paradise. I loved Florida. I loved St. Augustine and the school I was going to. But my dad suddenly, without much warning, took a job out on the Hamptons in East Hampton in the hotel business, which is where he had come through. His entire career was in the hotel business. But it means we had to leave Florida and move to Long Island. And I had been on Long Island. My dad and his father had a hotel in West Hampton Beach, but they sold that hotel in the early 50s. And the idea of going back to a place where there was actually cold weather really didn't appeal to me at all.
Get spoiled,
but
right?
then as I got there, I realized I didn't have any choices. And once I got settled into the Hamptons, and especially in the 50s, it was a terrifically wonderful place to be a teenager. And it was happy days to the 10th power. Because there was that soda fountain and we all hung out in after school, and there was those sock hops that we used to go to, and all of that things that have been recreated over the year in shows were very important. But nonetheless, my goal throughout my whole life up to that point had been to join the military when I was old enough. I was born at Camp Lejeune, North Carolina, in the Marine Corps, and I was never considered it. I loved music. I never considered it as a career. I just loved being able to play guitar a little bit, not much, but listen to my brother Skip, who played guitar very well, and then, of course, the band that he played in.
The Kingsmen. The other Kingsmen.
Yes.
Yeah.
Actually, he had a band in St. Augustine in 1955 called the Blue Suedes that was really one of the very first rock bands in that part of Florida. And then, of course, he went to Nashville with his lead singer, and they cut 2 songs produced by Chet Atkins, of all people.
Oh, boy. Wow.
Yeah,
Very
Chet
cool.
Atkins, one of his very first productions for RCA Victor, produced 2 songs for Skip and Arthur Osborne, his lead singer. So, yeah, I was really very impressed, and I loved music, but my goal was always to be in the military, hopefully in Marine aviation. But then in 1960, on the last day of school, I was out celebrating with my best friend and hitchhiked a ride home from the bowling alley where we were and got in a horrible car crash. And as a result, not only was I just about killed, any possibility of joining the military was ruled out by the extent of my injuries, which included a paralyzed right foot, which is still to this day disabled. So it changed my life, but when I realized I had 18 months of recovery on a sofa, my mom bought me an LGO Gibson acoustic guitar, and every day I would sit on that sofa after school, or if I wasn't going to school, all during the day, and just play the guitar with the songs of the day. My brother Skip would show me tips on how to play a guitar, how to be successfully progressing along. And so really the accidental occupation of a musician in a band happened because of moving to Long Island. So had I not moved to Long Island, there's a very good chance I would have ended up dead in a rice paddy in Vietnam.
Oh, heaven forbid.
That's where I was headed.
I mean, this is rhetorical, but isn't it really funny how life takes its turns?
Oh, man. You got to speak the volume on that alone.
Right.
It still happened to me to this day. Little things will turn, unexpected occurrences, and the next thing you know, you're off in a new direction. So I love it. I'm not at all somebody who's so conservative that they don't want change. I welcome change. I welcome new directions, and I'm very glad to still be able to receive them.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Now, the other Kingsmen evolved into the Lovin Spoonful. You knew Joe Butler from the Kingsmen. How'd you meet Zal and John?
Well, that's a great story because I had resolved in summer of '64, I told the Kingsmen that I was leaving the band to go to Europe with my best bud. We were going to buy motorcycles. We wanted to hear the British invasion sound in the home country, and we also wanted to see Europe. And Peter had family in Florence, Italy that he was going to visit. So we left in September of 1964, I quit the Kingsmen, and I planned on being back when the money ran out, which turned out to be December of 1964. We shipped our motorcycles home from Barcelona, Spain, after a fabulous 2 months in Europe. Almost everywhere you could go, we went. And then we hopped a flight to New York, and maybe 10 days later, I got a call from the shipping agency that my motorcycle was in New York and ready for pickup. So I called my brother Skip, who Joe Butler and he and 2 other musicians had moved the Kingsmen into Greenwich Village and changed the name to the Sellouts because they were a rock band playing in the heaven of acoustic instruments, right. Greenwich Village. And they were doing really well. And John and Zolly would come in to hear them play at Trudy Heller's on 8th Street in Greenwich Village. And in conversations between sets, John or Zolly would say, "Hey, man, we're looking for a bass player and a drummer. Do you know anybody?" And Skip or Joe, one of the 2 of them, would say, "Well, you know, Skip's brother Steve or my brother Steve is coming back from Europe in a couple of weeks, and maybe we could hook you guys up." So anyway, when I called Skip to ask him if I could stay at his apartment while I picked my motorcycle up, he said, "Yeah, but bring your bass when you come into town." I said, "Why? What do you want me to bring my bass for?" And he said, "Just bring your bass, and I'll tell you when you get here." So I packed my bass up, got on the train, rode into Penn Station, made my way down to Greenwich Village, hit Skip's apartment, and almost within an hour of being there and saying hello and everything, he says, "Here, now, go take your bass and go over to this little club in Greenwich Village. Here's the directions, and meet these 2 guys." So it was a cold, windy day, and I bundled up, grabbed my bass, headed over to West 3rd Street, this little place called the Village Music Hall, which would become famous as the Cafe Bazaar, where the Velvet Underground was first discovered. Mm-hmm. And so I met these 2 guys, one a very preppy-looking guy with these round glasses, almost looked like a college professor or a college student, and then this other wild-haired guy, obviously Jewish. You could just tell by looking at him and the way he talked that he had a Jewish personality. Mm-hmm. And from the very minute we met, it was really, obviously, I hate to use this word, but magic. It was just amazing how well we got along. The songs in our background, I got out my bass and they got out their guitars, and we jammed for about 2 hours. Every song that got brought up, we all knew, and we jammed them, and it was we just knew we had something. So that's how I met John and Zolly. And then we went over to Eric Jacobson's house on McDougal Street, and there the idea of putting a band together was pitched, and Eric Jacobson was going to be the producer. He was a folkie from his band was called the Novlik Upper 10,000, and Eric Jacobson was partnered up with John Sebastian, and Zolly was partnered up with this fellow who owned a nightclub in Washington, D.C. called The Shadows in Georgetown, a place that Bill Clinton would go to recreate when he was after hours. Mm-hmm. And he was Zolly's manager. So they said, "Look, we've got a manager, we've got a producer, we've got a guitar player, 2 singers, another guitar player. We need a bass player, and we need a drummer." And I said, "Well, I tell you what I'll do. I'm going to take this semester off." I had already registered for a semester in January at the Southampton College. And if we're not on the road promoting a record in 6 months, I'm going back to school in the fall. So that was the deal. And I said, I also know a drummer who has a rehearsal space out on Long Island that we can go rehearse at. And it wasn't Joe Butler. It was a fellow who also played in the Kingsmen, Jan Buchner, who went by the professional name Jan Carl. Mm-hmm. And so from that moment on, let's say it was December 17th, I launched a career that was going to end in 6 months if we didn't have a hit record.
Sure, it was going to end in 6 months.
And it was almost to the day, Steve, almost to the 6-month day that we were on a plane flying to San Francisco to promote Do You Believe in Magic? So, what can I say other than the fact it was magical?
Yeah, it does make you a believer in magic.
Doesn't it, though?
Yeah. Listeners, of course, we're speaking with the great Steve Boone, Rock and Roll Hall of Fame inductee, co-founder of the Lovin Spoonful, author of Hotter Than a Match Head, Life on the Run with the Lovin Spoonful. Listeners, you have got to get this book. I mean, the things we're going to talk about today we're just touching the surface. I mean, there are so many great detailed stories by Mr. Steve Boone. And one of them, if you can give us a brief recounting, how did you and Zal become known as the Death Duo?
Well, it's a complicated story, but I'll summarize it by saying that if you read the book, you can catch all the details that led up to us adopting that name. But Zolly and I, when we were on the road, especially after we came back from England in 1966, when we returned from our tour of England and Ireland and Sweden in April 1966, we felt on top of the world. We had the Beatles and the Rolling Stones as fans of the band. We had a huge successful tour in Europe. We knew Summer in the City was coming out in a month or two, and we were all convinced it was going to be our first #1 hit record. So when we were on the road, Zolly and I would just hang together. You know, we would fly next to each other on seats. We'd go out to restaurants together. We just hung together all the time when we were on the road. Then when we were back in New York, we all had our separate lives. But when we were on the road, we were inseparable. And so after the bust happened, which was just a month after returning from England, there was a fog hanging over Zolly and I, and it was a dense, thick fog, and we clung together because we were the two people that were involved in it. And so through a combination of circumstances, we sort of named ourselves as cartoon characters, something like you might see in a Marvel comic. Because Zolly was always quoting lines from comic books. So we called ourselves the Death Duo, as in, you know, a Superman-type comic.
Right.
And the name kind of stuck. It didn't have any deep connotation. It was just that we were laboring together through something that was really a huge distraction from the music.
Compadres. You were compadres.
We were compadres, exactly. Sure. And so, for whatever reasons we adopted the name Death Duo, it was because that we were linked in a greater than the band situation, and had to labor through it to see it to its entirety. And it was a difficult entirety. It would take an hour to explain it on the air here. And so that's why one of the reasons I wrote the book was to clear up the air about that. You know, it was in 1966 before any major band had been busted for pot. So really nobody knew what or how to deal with it. And so that was our... Go ahead.
Yeah, I will leave it up to our listeners to read all about it in the book, but I do want to say one thing, that there is truth to the phrase, you don't know a person until you've walked in his or her shoes. And there are points in the book, of course, hindsight is 20/20, Steve, but you would do certain things and I'm saying, oh no, what are you doing? But it makes perfect sense. All the events that occurred really make sense. And you explain it, and you explain it brilliantly.
Well, thank you. You know, again, I have to thank Tony Moss for helping me explain it in words that could be understood. But you know something, the question about the time that elapsed between many of these occurrences and 2014 when the book came out brings a lot of question as to why did you wait so long. Well, really, one of the reasons is that things have to come full cycle. Things have to sort of return to its starting point so that you can make a full explanation and you're not speculating about what will happen in the future or what may happen or what may not happen. And so by 2012, 2011, when I really first had gotten Tony's agreement to work with me, then all of a sudden digging up the research, it was very difficult for me because by that point Zolly had passed away.
Yeah,
I couldn't get to him for information. My two closest friends, Fudge, who worked for us as a roadie, and Billy Harvey, who was a classmate from school, had both all passed away. I had so limited resources outside of the band and my professional organization and my family, of course, to research that it was very important that all that time had passed so that I could look at the complete circle on things and not have to speculate, well, this may happen in the future or that may happen.
Mm-hmm.
So it was a very complete effort and a hard effort because it required a lot of digging deep and once again, Tony's ability to research and dig up those kind of things was just absolutely brilliant.
Mm. You mentioned earlier in our conversation that many of the songs you wrote had to do with real-life experiences, and one of those songs you wrote while reflecting on some of the events concerning Zal. I'm talking about the song Forever from the Everything Playing album. What can you tell us about the song Forever?
Well, for whatever reason, I took piano lessons when I was a youngster, like 8 or 9 years old, and didn't really stick with it, but I learned enough of the basics to be able to play, mostly in the key of C, but I play piano to write melodies on. And I had this melody that was like, it was kicking me in the head because I couldn't tie any words to it. It just, as much as I liked the melody, and I did, and the arrangement that I came up with it on the piano, I could not stick a lyrical line to it. So, over the years, Jerry Yester, who had been involved with the band from the very beginning,
mm-hmm.
he played piano on our very first hit record and helped us with vocal arrangements. And so I would see Jerry a lot, and he had heard me playing that tune on recording sessions and things like that. And he always expressed an interest in it. And so as 67 grew nigh and Jerry joined the band and Zowie left, we set about recording Everything Playing, which was an awesome feat considering it was the first album recorded on a 16-track recorder. Jerry took on the job of producing the album after our original producer decided that the technology was too hard for him to deal with. And he came to me with this idea. He said, that instrumental piece you've got, it just seems to stick in my head forever. And I went like, but we still didn't have lyrics for it. But I love that he said it sticks in his head forever. And of course, at this point, I'm going through a lot of the things about Zowie leaving the band, and I love Jerry, and his addition to the band was irreplaceable.
Yeah, he replaced Zowie for those listeners who aren't
He
familiar.
replaced Zowie, that's correct. And so I said, well, Jerry, what do you think? I can't come up with lyrics. He says, well, why don't we just forget lyrics and let's do an orchestration on this? I said, really? Because it was such an odd thing, you wouldn't think of it as being something you would orchestrate. And so he said, yes, let me work on the arrangement. So one of Jerry's skills is as an arranger. And he came up with this arrangement, and we had to hire a large group of orchestra musicians. And this was my chance to pay back King Charles, who was my mentor in the Kingsmen. King Charles was a saxophone player from Brooklyn that not retired, but moved out to Long Island to live in a more peaceful life than living in Brooklyn. And he was in the Kingsmen. That's why we were called the Kingsmen. We were King Charles's men, or King's men.
Mm-hmm.
And he mentored me through the transition from guitar to bass and really made a lot of things tie together. So I said, when can I pay back KC or King Charles for being my mentor? And Jerry said, well, can he be the orchestrator or the person who hires all the players? I said, I know he can. He's from Brooklyn. He has. So we got King Charles to hire this 24-piece orchestra that came in and did the arrangement that ended up with the song that's on the Everything Playing album called Forever. But I still hadn't titled it. I just loved Jerry's description, but I hadn't titled it. And so about a month before the album came out, we're driving to a gig in New Jersey down at Princeton University.
Mm-hmm.
And my manager called me and left a message, said, call me back as soon as you get this message. And so I called him back and says, the record company, we've got to have a final title. They're going to artwork. So I said, I don't have a final. He says, well, you got to give me one today or you're not going to have a title on that song. I said, well, call it Forever then. And in my mind, the reason that it was easy to call Forever was not just Jerry's description, but it was the fact that Zowie and I will share this bond forever that we went through, that so few people know what really we went through, and it just all seemed to be the perfect title for it. And when you listen to it, if you know the story behind the story, It's very evocative, I think. Jerry did a great job on arranging it.
Steve, can we listen to it right now?
Sure.
Beautiful song, Forever. Steve, when I listen to the song, it kind of evokes valleys and plateaus, kind of the up and down situations you and Zolly seem to go through. I mean, that's my amateur commentary on it, but even without lyrics, it tells the story.
Well, you nailed it, the up and down of it all. You know, when you're in a band and 99% of the audience has no idea there's this great drama going on behind the scenes, they just love the music and they're enthusiastic. So you're on a big up. And the minute you come off stage, you've got that reality of what's going on behind the scenes to face. And so it is a very up and down, up and down, up and down. Almost like, driving in the mountains, and you're up and then you're down. And you're up.
Beautifully written, Steve.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that. And I still enjoy listening to it to this day.
Yeah, so do I. Another song that you had written, If I Stare, never made it onto a Spoonful album. However, it did finally see the light of day on the album you made with your other band, Fork, F-O-R-Q. Now, we opened up with Here We Are from the Fork Chops album. May we talk a bit about Fork and listen to a few songs?
Yeah, absolutely. First, I'll kind of tell you the genesis of Fork. In 1997, Jerry Yester's daughter, Lena, she came in and filled in for a guitar player and keyboard player that was not working out for us.
In the Spoonful?
In the Lovin Spoonful, That's correct. Jerry and I and Joe Butler had restarted the band originally with Jerry's brother Jim Yester, but when he returned to the
association.
The association, I can't believe I forgot that.
That's
in 2003, Jerry's daughter Lena stepped in because the fellow that we initially hired didn't work out. And she was great. She was not only a great singer, but just a completely fast study on instruments. She could learn a song in a minute. So she was doing a great job. She played with us from 1993 to 1997. And, it's hard to describe this without sounding off color here, but I developed a great deal of attraction for Lena. And by 1997, when it was obvious she was wanting to leave the band and move on, we became a couple. Mm-hmm. And it was very difficult, although I have to say Jerry and Lena's mom, Marlene, couldn't have been nicer about it. I can easily say, well, Lena's an amazingly, mature woman, which she is. Mm-hmm. And still there's 32 years of age difference between us. And so there's no doubt eyebrows were raised, and it was difficult. I was married at the time and did not handle that well. And so it was a very difficult time. But Lena was such an amazing talent, musically speaking, and as a singer and songwriter, that when she left the band, I said, look, since we're now hanging together a lot, let's keep the songwriting thing going. And I gave her the idea for a song. It became The Mirror, which is on the Fork album. Yep. And then we decided, well, if we've got one song, why don't we just start a band that's entirely separate from the Spoonful, but connected to it, because in the band is going to be the band's drummer, Mike Arturi, who is the Spoonful's drummer, and then Lena, and then her sister, Hannah, who was also a very, very talented gal, and then me as bass player. So we had to connect it. Didn't have to, but we decided to connect it with the word fork. But since we didn't want it to be obviously a forkful of music, we decided to spell it differently. So we spelled it F-O-R-Q, which led to problems of its own that we were not aware of at the time. But nonetheless, spelling it that way gave other problems. But anyway, the album that we recorded, I contacted my old manager, Bob Cavallo, who managed us through the 60s, and by this time was the president of Hollywood Records, Disney's record label. And he initially listened to what we were doing and said, look, send me a demo when you get your demo done, and we'll see if we can consider it. And I made a huge mistake and sent him a demo way before it was ready to be done. I just was getting impatient. and I sent him an unfinished demo, and it really wasn't up to snuff. And so the Fork album didn't get onto a major label, but on that album were some terrific tunes written by Lena and me, and then a couple of songs that I wrote, and one of them was a song called If I Stare, and not take up a whole lot of time. If I Stare had its genesis in 1966 when we went to Sweden. This is John Sebastian's version of how it came about, by the way.
Okay.
We went to Sweden, and we were on a television show in Sweden with this group called the Hepstars. And in the band, the Hepstars, was a guy named Benny Andersson, who went on to form ABBA. And the Hepstars were such a great band, and I really loved them. But they had a song called, I can't remember what his name was, but it had a very catchy melody to it. So when we got home, and about 6 months later, I played this melody for John, and I said, I've got this idea for a song called If I Stare. And he said, oh, you stole that melody from the Hepstars and Benny Andersson. And I said, no, I didn't. It doesn't sound like it does. He said, yes, it does. And he made his comparison. Anyway, he was doing it in good nature. He wasn't being critical.
Sure.
He was kind of having fun with me. But then, when I finally finished the story up, by this point, the Spoonful had stopped touring. It was 1969 in the summer, and I took the song to our record company, Lovin Spoonful's record company. And I said, I got a friend of mine to sing it because I am not a lead vocalist. I can sing background parts, but as a lead vocalist, I leave a lot to be desired. So I had this friend of mine sing it. We took it to Compliment and Rubin, our record company, and they about fell out of their chair. They said, that is the next hit record by Lovin Spoonful. I said, well, it's not a Lovin Spoonful song. It's my song. I said, I want to record it. They said, okay, we'll give you a budget. Go in the studio and make a record of it. Long story short, I went in the studio and hired all my friends, and we just had big parties for like 2 weeks, ran up a huge budget, and I never could get the vocal right. To this day, I think that if a country music artist, especially a classic one, from older, meaning older, did that song, it could be a hit.
Absolutely.
It's just a great song. And so I knew I had to get it on an album somewhere, and so when we were recording the Fork album, and Lena said, we got to get one of your songs on here. And so I already had a song called Shining in the Moonlight, but I said, well, then let's try a version of If I Stare, and the musical bed came out great. Lena was, as a producer, just fabulous. She could really, very sparse instrumentation.
Great guitarist, by the way, Lena.
Great. Oh, she's a fantastic. Everything she touches musically, it's just a real, one of those people that has the magic touch, from her father, no doubt. Anyway, If I Stare got onto the Fork album, and with me singing, it was pretty good until the end when I kind of lost it.
You're being humble, Steve. No, it works from start to finish, but you're being humble. But
well, I appreciate the comment, and yes, I think it was the best version. Over the years, I've gotten other people to try and record versions of it, but nobody has been able to capture that essence of if I could sing better, that I would get it. But anyway, I've never given up on the song. I still think it's got potential. I
do too. How about if we share it with our listeners right now?
By all means. I hope they enjoy it.
Impure Thoughts from, really, what a wonderful album by Fork, F-O-R-Q. Fork Chops is the album. I can't recommend this enough, everybody. Download it, order it on Amazon. It's 10 magnificent tracks, top to bottom. And I love all the songs, but I wanted to play Impure Thoughts, Steve, not only because it's got such a great delivery, but I love the bass intro by you. I'd like to ask you a question. Now, I'm a total musical instrumental layman, but how can you tell a good bass guitar from a bad one? I mean, you see it, you pick it up, and then what happens?
Well, that's a great question, Steve, and I don't think I've ever been asked that question before. And I have feelings on it, very strong feelings, because I started in an era when bass guitar was still kind of the bastard child of a guitar, electric guitar. And there was amplifiers, but there wasn't good amplifiers and there was bass guitars with 4 and 5 strings, but the technology hadn't caught up to what makes a guitar sound great, doesn't necessarily transfer to what makes a bass sound great. So when I first started transiting from my Les Paul 6-string Gibson to a bass guitar, the fellow who played bass in the Kingsman, Clay Saunier, played an Epiphone, very lightweight, very small, long scale neck. And the way he played it, he was originally an upright bass player, an acoustic bass player, and he transferred to electric bass, and he still held the electric bass, not like a guitar, but like it was an acoustic, upright in a vertical position, and he held it close to his chin. I couldn't do that and fret the instrument the way he could, so I learned it in kind of a hybrid fashion. But what I found out is that there's really only, in 1962, I guess this was, there's only one bass that really plays like a real bass tone, and that was the Fender P bass. And so Clay's Epiphone sounded okay, but there weren't really amps that could duplicate the sound you really needed. There were jazz amps, the Ampeg B series. They were great amps, but they were for small, low-volume bands, jazz bands, or cocktail bands, things like that. As far as rock goes, there was nothing. Fender hadn't brought out its Bassman amp yet. It was just about to come out. But if you wanted to have a bass sound that really matched up with the bass drum, which is where the instruments marry, that's where rock and roll marries, is the bass drum and the bass guitar. The Fender bass was the only one. Now, when the Spoonful started, I had bought a really nice Fender P bass. I traded in my Les Paul Gibson for it. And when I first heard John play in a band, the night after I met him, he played with Felix Pappalardi in this ensemble that included Freddie Neal and Buzzy Linhart and Timmy Harden, John, and Felix Pappalardi.
All great names, yeah.
Oh, that night cemented my decision. That was the night that I said, if this is what I'm hearing and I'm not in some kind of a drug-induced dream, I am going to go with these guys. But anyway, Felix was playing a Guild Starfire bass, and because it fretted so nicely, Fenders were nice, punchy bass guitars, but they didn't fret easy. You had to really press down hard on those frets to make the note correctly. But Felix talked me into dropping my Fender bass and picking up a Guild bass, Starfire bass. And I wish he hadn't, because to tell you the truth, they eventually caught up with the technology, but it didn't sound like a bass at all. It sounded like a guitar tuned down low, and it didn't have the punch that the Fender bass had. So even with Guild making me a custom model, it still didn't, and so I went back to playing my Fender bass in the studio, not on stage because we made a deal with Guild to play the bass in television or in or in live performance. But I always played with the Fender bass because it was the solid length of that heavy neck that would translate those sounds. And now with the Fender Bassman amp, and then Magnatone brought out an upright bass amp, and then others were to follow, and an not acoustic yet, but Ampeg with the big Ampeg amplifiers, they started to get sound. But by this point, the Spoonful had pretty much broken up and gone our separate ways. But the answer to your question is very important, that the bass guitar, when you pick it up and you play it, that you either have a drummer sitting there, so when he hits his bass drum and you hit your bass note, those two sounds should lock together like a door lock. It should be like a click. And if they click together, you've got a good bass guitar. If it just sounds like a low note that sort of could come anywhere in the arrangement or anywhere in the ensemble, that bass guitar is not what you need for rock and roll. Now, we're talking about rock and roll,
right,
not jazz, not classical, not easy listening. But for rock and roll bass, you want to lock in so tightly with that drummer's bass drum That if those two sounds lock in, you've got a good bass. That's always been my theory.
Mm-hmm. Well, you really have made it make sense to a layman like me. And, Steve, I want to get back to this whole idea about the bass and some of your Spoonful bass songs. But I don't want to leave Fork yet. You mentioned the song The Mirror. And for me, it's funny you mentioned that because that is, for me, the single of the album. I
agree.
What can you tell us about The Mirror? You
Well,
mentioned
The Mirror, when Lena and I were first together and just hanging out, in the house and playing guitars, I had this little riff. It was just a 3-chord riff. And she took that 3-chord riff and turned it into The Mirror. And as soon as I heard it, I had the same thought you did. That is the single.
Yeah.
And so that was going to be our first single in all likelihood, had we had a major label release and the attendant push that a major label puts on. It was a song that was, she's just an amazing song. She came up with it in a couple of days' time, and as soon as I heard it, it was like, man, this is so from the heart, and it's just a great song. And so I had no doubt at all, but we didn't have the wherewithal to put on a release, sending out PR people to record labels, to radio stations and getting them to play it and things like that. I did what I could to promote it, but to tell you the truth, I was a little over my head there trying to be a record company. As a record company executive, I was a great bass player. I wasn't really, I was over my head, and I should have taken on a partner in the whole process to be that person, but I didn't. And there was a combination of a lot of things going on. Of course, me and Lena being together, and
life was going on, right?
Life was going on, and so yes, and life was going on at the speed of light, and so I had to pay attention to life, and as a result, the Fork album kind of got shelved, which is a shame because I agree with how your summation of it is. It was and is still a great album. And
the humor in the lyrics, it's just really a hidden treasure. And
I thank you for saying that. I wish I could convince Lena to go. She's working in animation now. She has a cartoon series which is a spoof or a takeoff on the Star Wars, and it's called The Farce Awakens. And she does animated characters, and then her sister and she come up with the voices. And there's so much work in creating an animated series that she doesn't really have time for creating new songs right now. But I'm constantly at her, like, come on, and I've actually gotten her to commit to helping me record some of my new songs that I've just written. So
excellent.
Who knows what the near future may be holding some real good treasures for us.
Great.
We'll see.
Well, how about if we listen to the quote-unquote the single from Fork Chops? I think we both agreed that The Mirror would have made a great one. How about if we listen to it right now?
That's a great idea.
The Mirror from Fork's album Fork Chops, F-O-R-Q, and once again, cannot recommend it enough. It's, of course, Steve Boone's in Fork, Lena and Hannah Yester, and Mike Arturi, who also is the Spoonful drummer now.
And a great drummer he is, too. Fantastic drummer.
Yeah, you mentioned how important it is for the bass player and the bass drum to click. And listeners, I want to tell you, boy, Steve Boone went above and beyond the call of duty. I asked him if he would make a list of Spoonful songs that he felt were very expressive or showed some of his favorite bass playing in the Spoonful, and he was so nice to come up with the list. I thought what we'd do, Steve, is I'd go down the list and then we'd listen to them all as one set. And so, you okay with that?
Yeah, sure,
okay.
Absolutely. It's so interesting because the Spoonful was such a different step for me from what I had been playing. That it's very exotic.
So one of the maybe just a quick thumbnail on each. Jug Band Music was one of the songs you
Well, jug band. Remember now, the Lovin Spoonful combined folk and rock, which is what we are all famous for, and the folk part of it, a lot of traditional songs, and John Sebastian came from a jug band that he was in called the Even Dozen Jug Band. A jug band, for folks that don't know, were bands that formed during the Depression when the instruments couldn't be bought, so they made instruments out of a big wash tub, and a broom handle would be the bass, and then you would have a washboard would be a rhythm instrument, and of course you'd have a harmonica, which was very inexpensive, easy to buy that, and then you would have all these various instruments. A jug you would blow, like a gallon jug, you'd blow into the top of it to make bass notes. So there was a lot of things, and John was in this band called the Even Dozen Jug Band. And so one of our big influences in the band starting up was the Jim Kweskin Jug Band. So we had a lot of jug band stuff going on in the early days of the Spoonful. And when John came up with this song, Jug Band Music, I loved it from the get-go, but I said, how can I bring my rock-based style into a jug bandy kind of song? And I said, John, do you care if I kind of put it into he says, you run with what you got. Run with what you brung. And so I got in our rehearsal, and I said, well, I'm going to try and put a rock bass line rather than trying to have a traditional 2 and 4. I put in a do-do-do-do-do-do-do-do-do.
Great
and
sound.
it worked. It just managed to really work in such a way that when it came time after the introduction for the singing, then I went back to a traditional 2 and 4 bass part, and it worked. And so from that point of view, it was a very successful marriage of rock-style bass and jug band-type roots. And it worked on jug band music, and it worked on a couple others. One of my favorite Spoonful songs is "Wild About My Lovin'." And
we're going to listen to that one as well. Yeah.
Right, I didn't play so many bass notes, but I played a kind of a meld between rock and folk style, and it worked out with John's unique style of singing, which is another root cause for the Spoonful's great sound.
So we have jug band music, "Wild About My Lovin'." Another one on your list was "Did You Ever Have to Make Up Your Mind?"
Yeah, well, that one, and this is very interesting because Joe and I had played together in a band, and Joe is the master of the big swing style of drumming that was so popular in the 50s. But he wasn't as much a master of the style that is required for playing along with folk music. But Mike Arturi, who is the Spoonful's drummer, and so when I played live with Joe, Did You Ever Have to Make Up Your Mind, I didn't click on the bass part. It was a complicated bass part. It had a lot of nuance to it, and we got it right in the studio, so it was good on the record, but every now and then on live performance we didn't click. But with Mike in the Spoonful, he and I really clicked together, so that as time went on, the bass part got better for live performance on Did You Ever Have to Make Up Your Mind, to whereas now, when Mike and I are really having a good night, anybody that hears that song in live performance are going to be amazed by it, because we hit on so many notes it almost sounds like we're the same person. Of course, it's impossible to play drums and bass at the same time.
Great.
So
sounds.
Anyway, that was another example of a song that was good bass part, but got better over time as the parts tightened up between the drummer and bass player.
Another one was "There She Is."
Well, now "There She Is" and "Let the Boy Rock and Roll" were two examples of my original style of bass playing that I learned from playing Chuck Berry songs, from playing Elvis songs, from playing the hits of the late 50s and early 60s. That's just a wild open big swing, dun 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 kind of thing. And so Eric, our producer, who was a folk music producer and really didn't get the combination of bass drum and bass, he got it, but he kept it down in the mix. And I have to say, Eric is a genius. He made the Spoonful record sound great, but I kind of wish he'd put a little bit more volume on the bass and kick drum. But anyway, that was those were examples of me being my original style, Steve Boone from the Kingsmen. And I played them real well because I was playing with Joe, and it was like we were back in the Kingsmen again.
Right, and there you have that.
Yeah, just we had that clicking of having played for 3 or 4 years together before the Spoonful, so we knew where each other was going to hit and where the parts would come in. So those two in particular really rocked out as far as rock versions. But I guess at the end of the day, my favorite bass part for the Lovin Spoonful repertoire is not actually a recorded version. Well, it's recorded, but not one of our records. It was a live performance of the Lovin Spoonful on the Tammy Show in 1966.
What a show.
It was a great show with a lot of great artists on it. And we played You Didn't Have to Be So Nice, the second of 2 tunes. And we were so wound up being live, and the sound was great. That live performance of Joe and me on You Didn't Have to Be So Nice is, I think, my best bass playing of the entire Spoonful career. And it comes across great. The engineers that were miking and recording it did a fabulous job, and you can really hear the bass and the drums playing along with the guitars and vocals in that particular take on the Tammy Show.
Well, I think that might be a good one to start off with, and then we're going to hear the other songs we discussed. But I just want to say this to our listeners, Steve. In 2006, the Tammy Show was deemed culturally, historically, and aesthetically significant by the United States Library of Congress and selected for preservation in the National Film Registry. So important was that show that it's now in the National Film Registry. So let's start it off with, boy, I couldn't agree with you more, that the bass playing on this is just fantastic. Live version of You Didn't Have to Be So Nice, and then we'll hear our 5 other songs. So enjoy, everyone.
So I was a both fan. I was one of those rare oddballs, but I love surf music. I love the soft voices and the great harmonies. And I thought they rocked too, but the way the things were in those days, you had to have the greased back hair and and talk like this, that, and these.
Right. Well.
So anyway, yeah. Well, a lot of my friends would go, "Are you guys ever?" And that's when Summer in the City came out. We quieted all those critics. So.
Yeah. Well, before Steve, we talked about The Mirror being a perfect single. It's tough choosing a band's next single, as you so brilliantly explained in your book. I know you had reservations with Rain on the Roof following Summer in the City. Could you please tell us why you felt that way?
Well, for the reasons that I just spoke to. I thought Summer in the City had finally established us as the rock band I knew we were. And I felt, and don't get me wrong, I thought Rain on the Roof. I was actually in the studio when John and Zoe were doing the guitar parts. And I kind of dozed off because they were tuning or something like that, and they weren't actually playing, and I was on the couch. And next thing, I woke back up, and these 2 guitars are playing back over the speakers, and I'm going, man, that is the nicest, prettiest guitar work. And it turned out that was the final take for Rain on the Roof. So I loved the song. The lyrics are very maudlin and sappy. But, there's a place for that, too.
There really is. As a listener.
And so I love the song. And we don't do it live. I wish we did. I'm trying to get the rest of the band excited enough to start doing Rain on the Roof again.
I'd love to hear it live.
Well, I would too, and we do. We have done it live recently. We just don't do it regularly. Mm-hmm. But when I thought about what single is going to follow Summer in the City, and we had some great ones in the can, I just was like, guys, I think we're kind of treading down some very thin ice here if we go back to the very soft kind of songs that we're losing fans over. And whether I was right or wrong doesn't make any difference because it's a matter of personal taste. The record company was determined, and I think John was quite determined to release it. He was in the throes of a romance with his current girlfriend at the time, and
right.
Obviously the song was written about her, and so that's the way it went down. But I have to repeat that it's a wonderful, very beautiful, pretty song. It was a big hit in Europe, but it was not a big hit in the States. It did make the top 20. I think it might even have made it into the top 10. I don't know for sure. But it wasn't the hit that I thought we should have had to follow up Summer in the City, especially considering we had Let the Boy Rock and Roll, and songs that were already recorded.
I think Four Eyes was one of the songs you mentioned that would have been a good follow-up. Talk about a rock and roll song.
Absolutely. Four Eyes, and I think John resisted releasing that because it was written about himself. And so, but I don't know. I'm just speculating.
Yeah.
Maybe John would love to have heard it as a single. And I loved it. It was a great rock tune, but instead the record company, and I think with John's influence and urging, put out Rain on the Roof. And then, it was a hit. It was. Mm-hmm. It just wasn't as big a hit as it should have been.
Yeah. And you think it's all because of placing, of, timing, that maybe it could have followed Four Eyes and maybe been a bigger hit. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Exactly. Yeah. Give us a run of 2 or maybe 3 rockers, and then go back to us.
Yeah.
And plus, we had songs coming up like "Darling Be Home Soon." We had songs coming up that we were written and either were about to be recorded or were recorded that were great soft rock songs. But let the Spoonful establish its cred as a rock band that can kick ass as well as play the soft and gentle stuff.
Yeah, so, I think one of the things I've always been impressed with the Spoonful was that each album did kind of offer a different sound in aspects of it. We wanted it to be that way. We were in full reaction to the record, not only our record company, but all record companies' policy of cloning the hit that you had today for the next release, on the theory that, if they like this one, they'll love the next one. But we want it to be, no, we want people to like music because it's not like our last one, so it's different. People think in different directions, and we weren't successful because the record company does what they want to do. Yeah. It's funny how the albums did go by that, different each time out, but the singles, like you said, may have sometimes been a little too similar. But listen, I love all the Spoonful songs. In the book also, Steve, sailing has always been a big part of your life, both positively and perhaps negatively, as you mentioned in the book. But I would love to just keep the positive vibes going. What is it about sailing that's so great to you?
Well, let me tell you. When I moved to Florida, we've been living in the Pocono Mountains, as far from an ocean practically as you can get. But we would winter every year for a month. My grandfather had a place in St. Augustine, Florida. Before we moved there, we would winter for a month in St. Augustine. So I grew to like the ocean, and I was young, 8, 9, very young kid. Mm-hmm. Loved going in the ocean, but I had no experience with boating. Then in 1954, we moved there in response to my brother Charlie getting burned very badly and needing to be in a humid climate to aid his recovery from his burns. And a year after being there, my dad, who was a hobbyist, a carpenter by hobby, got involved with the Rotary Club in St. Augustine with their what's called the Optimus Pram sail. It's an entry-level boat for teaching young men and women how to sail. And I took an immediate liking to it. And as a result, my dad was one of the first to build the new mahogany plywood state-of-the-art Optimus Pram sailing boats in 1955. And sailing one of his boats, I took the club championship and went to several out-of-town regattas and did very well, with the exception of the very first regatta I went to, which is covered in the book.
Yeah.
And
your dad made you get right back on the horse, though, right?
Oh, he didn't give me any choice. He gave me a choice, but the other two was not a good choice.
You're right.
So I did so well at sailing, and it just opened up a whole new vision for me of being on the water, that from that point on, from 1950, let's say 56 on, sailing was in my back pocket. It was something I not only wanted to do to compete and race, but I had started reading books about living on a small sailboat or sailing in ocean races. And Carlton Mitchell, a famous author, wrote a book about his sailboat Finisterre and living on it in the Caribbean and racing the Bermuda race. It just all fascinated me. It became, like I said, my back pocket. Sailing was never far from my life after that. So in the 1960s, after the Spoonful had some success, I bought a 24-foot sloop out on Long Island, a Mauritius Bay sloop, and sailed that for a couple of years, and all the while getting my chops warmed up for buying a boat big enough to actually live on and actually spend time, not just a week or a weekend. And in 1968, I took a vacation to the Bahamas with my best bud Peter and his wife Sandy and my girlfriend Denise. And we went out to Elbow Key in the Abacos, and I rented a small 30-foot Triton, Pearson Triton sailboat for a week. So that was my first experience living aboard in tropical waters, and it made the deal. From that point on, I knew I had to get a sailboat that was big enough to actually live on. And so it just launched a lifelong passion for sailing that in 1977, after I had returned, in 1970, I bought a 56-foot sailboat. And I moved lock, stock, and barrel onto the sailboat. A dog and a cat, my wife Patty and me, we moved onto a sailboat and for 4 years lived in St. Thomas and the Virgin Islands.
Oh, boy.
And
Paradise.
The whole Eastern Caribbean was our backyard. So we had a great time. Then I came back moved to Baltimore, started my studio, and then in 1977, a friend of mine called up and said, Steve, I know you're a real fan of sailing and you live on the Chesapeake Bay. How would you like to make some money using your sailing skills? And I said, well, let's meet and talk about it. And in the back of my mind, having lived in the Caribbean and seen some of my other buddies sailing down to Colombia and coming back with quite a load of Colombian marijuana, I knew that's what the conversation was going to be about. But since it was on a phone, I said, let's just meet somewhere and talk about it. And one thing led to another, and the next thing you know, I'm off captaining a 45-foot sailboat, heading for Colombia. And
I don't mean to laugh, but
well, it was like, for me at first, it was a huge gamble.
Yeah.
But in a way, because of the way the whole bust in San Francisco ended, left such a bad taste in my mouth. And there's some details in between that happened in Baltimore. You've got to read the book to find out why I felt this way. But I felt like, something, law enforcement lied to me. And they didn't treat me fairly when they had the chance to.
Yeah, that was a screw job. That was a real screw job.
It was a screw job, and it was like, well, screw that, man. I have pretty high standards, but I didn't see anything wrong with smoking marijuana at the time. I still don't. And so I felt that if I could make some money and save my recording studio, which was desperately in need of cash, then I'm going to go do it. And for 3 years, we did very well. We made 3.5 successful runs. And then, as all illegal operations happened, we ended up getting busted. And I, got convicted and paid my fine, did my time, and then was put on probation and successfully finished that and moved to back to Florida in 1986. But those years sailing, and I'll say this to anybody that asks me, was as exciting as any concert I ever did with the Lovin Spoonful. Playing for any audience we ever played for, including the Beatles and the Stones and Tara Brown. It was as exciting as it gets. When you're out at sea and you can't pull into port because there's a storm, or you can't stop because you ran out of fuel, it's a whole new way of life. And then when you do have to come into land and offload your cargo, that's another entire level of anticipation and stress. So to me, it was a fantastic experience. I am extremely glad that I did it, even with all the negative after effects.
And you still sail to this day?
I sure do. In fact, I had a little cabin cruiser that I restored over the last 2 years. I sold it last summer, and there's a little 30-foot sailboat up in St. Augustine for sale that's been sitting there for a long time. I keep wondering if it doesn't have my name on it because it's such a nice... But anyway, I don't have one right at the moment, but any opportunity I can to hop on somebody else's sailboat, I take it up in an instant.
Beautiful. Well, Steve, we're winding down, but a couple of things. First of all, congratulations on finally your induction into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in 2000. Boy, you guys were so overdue. You should have been in your first year of eligibility. In the book, you described the experience as bittersweet. How so?
Well, it was an honor. There's no doubt about it. But the one thing that I was most perturbed about, and for good reason, was the fact that they refused to include Jerry Yester as part of the band.
Now, since '67, right, Steve? He was part of the band?
Well, he was not only part of the band
yes.
full time in '67, but he played on our very first hit record as the piano player. He helped with vocal arrangements on the first album, and then he actually single-handedly saved everything playing from getting not finished by stepping in when the producer couldn't finish it. And so my point was, like, why do you let roadies from the Grateful Dead be inducted into the band, into the Hall of Fame, and not let somebody who literally, because their argument was he had to have played on all the original albums. And I said, Susan Evans was the president at the time. I said, Susan, that does not hold water when you look at the hall and see who's in the Hall of Fame, and a lot of people aren't even musicians. They're managers or they're roadies or they're light technicians. I said you don't have a cogent argument here, and so they just wouldn't relent. And so for me, I almost didn't go. I just felt like this is such a slap in the face to Jerry, who deserves it. But then I went, and I'm glad I did. I was, as I told in the book, I was a little disappointed that we didn't try to do something for our live performance that wouldn't require John to try singing.
Yeah.
But that's neither here nor there, because we did it. And
he's got some voice problems, sure, for those listeners. That
yeah. And, John, he does shows, and he does a great show nowadays by going out and talking a lot about behind the scenes, and he sings a little bit. I actually did a duel with him right before the book came out down in Claremont, Florida, and it was great, a great show. So he does tremendous shows, but if we had have done Night Owl Blues with him playing mouth harp and Zolly on guitar, me and Joe on rhythm section, we would have brought that house down. Mm-hmm. It would have floored the place. Instead, you could hear about 8 people clapping when we stopped playing the 2 songs we played. So, it was just one of those situations where a great honor was marred by stubbornness on the part of the Hall.
Yeah, well, you got a chance to thank your brother, which was very nice. That's a nice positive, yeah.
That was absolutely the most essential. Skip and his band Auto Salvage, which me and Zolly, the Death Duo, produced a demo for them to get their deal with RCA. They were way ahead of their time. They were the Led Zeppelin 4 years before Led Zeppelin even brought his first album out. And so they didn't get the credit they deserved until just a few years ago, when the band was recognized as having a huge cult following, especially in England. And they appeared at South by Southwest in Austin, Texas. I think it was 5 years ago. And Skip couldn't go because he had trouble with his eyes and couldn't see well enough to be out in public. So, but at least he got the recognition of knowing that the Auto Salvage band got the recognition they deserved. It was great. well overdue credit for him.
And hey, Steve, the Spoonful were favorites of the Beatles and the Stones, so that's a Hall of Fame right there to have that recognition. That's right.
That meant as much or more to know that our peers that we felt highly about also felt the same way about us.
Hey, I just want to mention, too, to the listeners, there's so much in the book, and Steve talks about being at the Beatles Shea Stadium concert. Oh, my goodness, we could have gone on and on forever. But before we say goodbye, I mentioned earlier that my brothers and I recently saw you guys in concert, and it's great that we can still see the Spoonful on tour. Let our listeners know, if you don't mind, who makes up the current lineup.
Right. Well, before I say the current lineup, let me also mention that if you buy my book at my website, steveboone.net, I personally attend to that and will endorse the book any way you'd like it to be made out, and I personally sign it.
Wonderful.
And also will include a really rare collectible card that features the Lovin Spoonful on it. It was the Dick Clark Productions thing back in the 90s. It didn't really catch on, but they gave us a a stock of them as part of our, payment for doing the thing. And so I include that with the purchase of a book too. And like I said, I answer and send off the book in priority mail. So from the time of the order, it takes about 3 or 4 days to get the book in your hands.
Guys, forget I mentioned Amazon.com. Go right to steveboone.net. That's a much better
you'll probably get a better price. You'll probably get a better price on Amazon, but you'll get a much more custom feeling and personally delivered by me on steveboone.net.
Absolutely.
And then the current lineup, of which I am so proud about this band, we sound so good, and it includes 2 new guys, and by new, they've been with us almost 20 years. Well, actually, Mike has been with us 20 years, and Phil will be 20 years this summer. And so
Phil Smith,
our newest member is Philip Smith, and he's the owner of a fantastic guitar store, or a music store, but featuring stringed instruments in Harrison, Arkansas. Great little town. It's in the heart of the bluegrass Ozark Mountain picking area. And he's been with us since 1998 and sings and plays lead guitar. And then Mike Arturi, who's our drummer since 1996. And he also has a fabulous music school called the Universal Music Center in Red Wing, Minnesota, teaching new young people how to play music of all kinds, and a great addition to the band, and also is in charge of our merchandise. And then Jerry Yester is our musical director, a lead guitarist and lead vocalist, and Joe Butler is the lead vocalist, plays guitar and auto harp, and then yours truly, Steve Boone, on the bass guitar and real cranky
known as Flasher in Fork, and I don't want to know why.
Known as Flasher, that's right.
And finally, Steve, before we say goodbye, of course, we must talk about the song Summer in the City. Without your contribution to the song, it wouldn't be the great song we know and love, but your contribution has made it brought it up to that other plateau. Will you share with the audience what your major contribution to the song was?
Absolutely, Steve, and it's a great point you bring up. There's in drag racing, there's a thing called the racer's edge. Drag races are decided by 1/1000th of a second or 1/100th of a second. So the racer's edge is somebody who has equal equipment but has that little something extra that racing against the guy with, or swimmers have the same thing. Swimmers events end with just 1/1000th or 1/1000th of a second, separating the winner from the second place.
Right. Mm-hmm.
And they had the racer's edge. I've said, and I feel very strongly, that the part I added to is what we call a middle eight. John took a song that his brother Mark had written and brought the lyrics up to speed and worked with the melody. And then when we were recording it, we needed a middle eight section. And I had this piano piece that I played constantly. And anytime I was around a piano, I would sit down and play it. And John said, I think that part Steve plays is really going to fit in nicely between the verses and the choruses, and will work as our middle eight. And once we got it in there, I was skeptical. I didn't think, because it changes tempo and it changes rhythm.
That's the dun, 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 dun.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And, I've had, over the years, players that are really well-respected players, jazz players, and highly respected in all the genres, say to me, that middle eight section is the thing that separates Summer in the City from just another number one hit record.
Absolutely.
And so I don't say that to pat myself on the back so much as just to really pat myself on the back.
No, and rightly so. May I pat you on the back? Because take out the middle eight, it's a good song, great song, but like I said, it puts it on another plane with that middle eight.
Yeah, exactly. I've had some people compare it to Gershwin, and I would never take that comparison because I'm not that even familiar with Gershwin material. Of course, I know how great he was, but it is an offbeat type of rhythm thing, and it's something that I love to do on piano. I still do things like that today, and that's why I'm so excited about my new music, because some of it has a lot of that offbeat stuff in it. So yeah, I'm very pleased that I was able to participate in that song. I'm very thankful to John and Mark for including me in it, and for Eric for working me in as the engineer and producer, and Roy Howie of Columbia Records. It's been a record that's sustained me through my entire career, from an encouragement point of view and also financially. So I'm extremely very grateful and very happy to have been part of it.
Well, I mean, whatever financial means you get from it, it's well worth it, and something that money can't even buy for us listeners. We just appreciate so much all you've done, Steve.
Well, if you could live forever, those are the important things. And, of course, none of us can live forever, so you have to enjoy, and while you're here, the things that you can enjoy. And that is, just hearing you say that is a reward enough in itself. So
well, it's from the
heart. I
heart.
appreciate it.
And, Steve, thank you so much. Listeners, go to lovinspoonful.com for the tours, because I'll tell you, you're going to get goosebumps when you hear those songs come to life again. SteveBoone.net for the book. And Steve, I as I said at the top, I can't tell you, it's a dream come true to have been able to talk to you, and I simply can't thank you enough.
Well, Steve, your show is such a tremendous show, and your website, everything about what you're doing really reflects your sincere appreciation of the music, and that's something that you can't just duplicate. You have to have it in your heart. And so I really looked forward to this talk with you, and it's lived up and even beyond his expectations. So I had a great time, and thank you very much for bringing up all the points you did, and in such a nice way too. I had a tremendous time.
Well, it's great to know that the people you admire are even better people than you could have imagined, and that's you, Steve Boone. So once again, thank you so much, and I hope we can speak again sometime. I'd love to meet you in person sometime.
We definitely will, Steve. I will keep you in close touch should our travels bring us anywhere near you, and I'm sure it will, too, and you must be our guest at the show the next time.
Oh, my goodness. Thank you so much, Steve. It's been a pleasure.
Well, my pleasure, too, and thank you, Steve, and we'll talk soon.
Thank you. Bye-bye now, Steve.